Yes. We will continue with the basic flow chart for other settlement methods. And what are the other settlement methods? We already have an idea. The other settlement methods are, it is advance payment, open account, documentary collection payable on a site basis, documentary collection payable on nuisance basis. These are all the other settlement methods other than what we will be taking up in this entire course, that is on documentary credits. So the other settlement methods are advance payment, open account, documentary collection on site basis, documentary collection payable on nuisance basis. Now let us see how we will see the flow chart for advance payment. And we already know that out of these four methods, which is the least secure and which is the most secure. See, for an exporter and for an importer. And as we can see, for an exporter, cash in advance would be the most secure because he is already ready with the cash. Whereas the open account would be the least secure because the goods would be dispatched. He would not be sure whether he would get his amount. So, and cash in advance would be the least secure for an importer, whereas open account would be the most secure for an importer. So we already know this in those methods of settlement, four methods of settlement. Now let us see how we will go with advance payment. Advance payment is the form of settlement that offers the least risk to the seller. So the seller gets the least risk because he's already got the amount in his hand. But it is a high level of risk to the buyer. To the buyer, it is a very risky area because he is parting with his funds. So, can we see this in advance payment? Here is the seller, here is the buyer, this is the seller's bank, this is the buyer's bank. In advance payment, what is happening? First, the payment is already remitted. So the buyer sends it to the buyer's bank, goes to the seller's bank, the seller bank credits to the seller's account. So the seller is very secured with advance payment. Least risk to the seller, but very high risk to the buyer. So the contract is agreed. How does this happen? Advance payment, how does this happen? The contract is agreed between the buyer and the seller, indicating advance payment as the method of settlement. The buyer instructs his bank to make payment to the seller's account with a specific bank. So the banker of the buyer makes payment as requested by the buyer. So the banker of the seller credits the amount to the account of the seller under advice. The seller ships the goods. So the contract is agreed between the buyer and the seller, indicating advance payment as the method of settlement. The buyer instructs his bank to make payment to the seller's account with a specific bank. So the banker of the buyer makes payment as per the instructions of the buyer, debiting the buyer's account. So the banker of the seller credits the amount to the account of the seller under advice. The seller ships the goods. So once the amount is received, the seller ships the goods. So here these are the 5 steps in advance payment. So in this example, the buyer made payment in accordance with the contract, but he had no guarantee. The buyer had no guarantee that the goods would be shipped once the payment has been made. The payment has been made, but whether the goods would be shipped, there was no guarantee for the buyer, or the goods whether it would be of the required quality, because we do not know what type of goods would be sent by the seller. So there is no guarantee of the required goods. But there are some reasons why the buyer adopts this method of settlement. 1. The seller may be unwilling to ship the goods to the country in which the buyer is located prior to receipt of payment. So before receiving the payment, the seller may be unwilling to ship the goods to the country in which the buyer is located. And we usually call this as country risk. What do we call this as? Country risk. Then the buyer may wish to encourage the seller into a long-term trade relationship. The buyer is thinking about entering into a long-term trade relationship with the seller. So he is interested in remitting advance payments. So these are the two reasons why adopting this method of payment. Seller may be unwilling to ship the goods to the country in which the buyer is located prior to receipt of the payment. We usually call this as the country risk. Secondly, the buyer may wish to encourage the seller to enter into a long-term trading relationship. So the buyer is interested to enter into a long-term trading relationship. Then seller may not have the finance. See, now the seller has to ship the goods. Unless he gets some money, he may not be able to manufacture or procure the goods. So the seller may not have the finance in order to buy the goods or prepare the goods for shipment. In order to buy the goods or prepare the goods for shipment. And the buyer may feel comfortable with his relationship with the seller. So with both the credit and country risk relating to the seller. So the seller is having both the risk, country risk and credit risk. So the buyer is interested to have a comfortable relationship with the seller in the long-term trading. So that is why this advance payment account comes into the picture. So who is very secure here? It is a seller, because he has already received advance payment. He is able to procure the goods and then ship the goods. But what about our buyer? He is having the highest risk because he has already parted with his amount. We do not know whether he will get the goods of the required quantity, quality, all these risks he will have to bear with. But the only criteria would be the buyer would enter into a long-term trading relationship and he may feel comfortable with the seller. The next settlement method we are talking about is the open account. Open account. Can you see, this is the buyer, this is the buyer's bank. This is the seller's bank. Buyer and the buyer's bank, seller and the seller's bank. So let's see now what happens in an open account settlement method. Open account is another form of settlement. Here it is the least risk to the buyer. Least risk to the buyer, but a high level of risk to the seller because he has to ship the goods in advance. The buyer is having the least risk. The seller has to ship the goods in advance. That is the point. So let's see the steps how this open account comes into the picture. The contract is agreed between the buyer and the seller, indicating what is the method of settlement? Open account. The seller arranges shipment of the goods according to the agreed terms and forwards the underlying shipping documents. He ships the goods and all the underlying shipping documents, the seller forwards it to the buyer. So who is very safe? The buyer is safe. Yes. And this buyer, if he is satisfied with all the goods and the documents, he will instruct his bank to make settlement to the seller. So the buyer will instruct his bank, please make settlement to the seller in the manner requested. Then the bank of the buyer makes payment to the banker of the seller. So the banker of the seller credits the amount to the account of the seller under advice. Under advice, the banker of the seller credits the amount to the account of the seller. So this is an open account. So here you see the seller had no bank undertaking. He has shipped the goods, but there was no bank undertaking for the seller. So he was entirely relying upon the good relationship of the buyer to make payment according to the agreed sales contract. The seller had to depend upon the buyer on the basis of the agreed sales contract. And with business conducted on open account terms, the seller will dispatch the good to the buyer, but there is no guarantee of payment. There is no guarantee of payment to the seller. There is no bank entering into a commitment. On dispatch, the seller sends the buyer an invoice together with other shipping documents for payment. This payment could be at an agreed date or it could be at the end of an agreed period. The payment could be at the end of an agreed period or on an agreed date, the payment would be expected. from the buyer. So, in open account, the seller had no bank undertaking. No bank undertaking. He had to rely upon the good relationship with the buyer. Yes. So, the agreed period might be payment at the end of the month, following the month of shipment. Then the buyer will make arrangements on the relevant date according to the terms of the sale contract. According to the terms of the sale contract. So, the buyer may use any appropriate payment method. Buyer will use any appropriate payment method in the market. Maybe an international bank transfer, or he may even send a bank draft, or anything, whatever method is requested by the seller, he will use that transfer method to see that the amount reaches the seller's bank and the seller's bank credits to the account of the seller. It could be by international bank transfer, or it could be even by a bank draft, or our SFMS messages could be sent. So, this is an open account. Now, let's see what happens in the next after the open account. Open account trading is most commonly used. Two companies have a long-term trading relationship. So, here we understand one thing. There is a long-term trading relationship between the seller and the buyer. Then this settlement method comes into picture, open account. So, advance payment we have studied, open account we have studied. And in open account, transaction between sellers and buyers located in countries in Western Europe, United States are often conducted on this basis. It's very common in United States and Western Europe, transactions taking place between the seller and the buyer in countries like Western Europe and United States. Sellers may use open account trading even to secure contract with parties in some developing countries. So even in developing countries, these traders, they may enter into open account relationship to which documentary credit terms have been applied in the past. So already some terms and conditions have been applied. So the seller may feel comfortable to secure some new contracts in developing countries. But this is very common in Western Europe and United States. It's very common open account. So what are the advantages of open account? It is very, very simple to administer. Open account is very simple to administer. Minimum bank fee. The fee charged with the banks are also very less because there is no undertaking, no guarantee given by the bank. It is very attractive to buyers because the buyers get an opportunity to examine the goods. The buyers get an opportunity to examine the goods before they make the payment. So before they make the payment, they can examine the goods. Sellers using open account methods obtain no security of payment. They have to rely entirely on the credit worthiness of the buyer, the good faith of the buyer. So the seller has to depend on the credit worthiness and the good faith of the buyer. Whereas for a buyer, it is the minimum fees and it is very, very attractive method, open account. So open account is a very attractive method. So we have seen advance payment, open account, and we also go with another method, that is documentary collections. The documentary collection is another method of settlement. And let us see the situation under documentary credits and documentary collections, which is a little different from advance payment and a little different from open account. So it is different from open account and advance payment when we talk about documentary collections and documentary credits. The seller here in these two methods, he will obtain the security of a bank undertaking. So in documentary collections and credits, the seller obtains the security of a bank undertaking or a bank retaining control over the documents that relate to the shipment. So the documents that relate to the shipment, there will be some control. So the only involvement by banks, so in open account, the only involvement by banks in open account is only when there is a transfer of funds. Only when there is a transfer of funds. Only when there is a transfer of funds, there is the involvement of bank in open account. Now, let's see how does this documentary collection and documentary credit work with always open account and advance payment. So you can see that here there is to some extent the involvement of the banks involving in the documents. So that is the contrast which we are going to look into now, where the bank comes into the picture. So documentary collection, let us see now on a site basis, payable on a site basis. This is a settlement method where the risk can be reduced. The risk is reduced for both the buyer and the seller. In advance payment, very high risk for the buyer, and in open account, very high risk for the seller. But here you see, here in this collection, a documentary collection on site basis, we will find that there is a reduced risk for both the buyer and the seller. The buyer need not pay the collection until he has viewed all the documents at the office of the bank. So the bank which receives is known as all the documents is known as the collecting bank. So the seller knows that the documents will be held with the banking system. So however, the seller knows that still he has no guarantee of payment. And here the seller is known as the principal. What is the seller known as? The principal. And the seller's bank is known as the remitting bank. What is the seller's bank known as? Remitting bank. They may present it through another bank known as a presenting bank. And the bank where the documents reach finally is the collecting bank. So here the seller is known as the principal. His banker is known as the remitting bank. It comes either directly to the collecting bank or through an intermediary bank, the presenting bank. So let's see how documentary collection payable on a site basis. Can you see? Here is the buyer. Buyer is also known as the drawee. What is the seller known as? Drawer. Buyer is also known as the drawee. And here seller, here in this situation, we call him as the principal. Generally we say is the drawer of a bill of exchange. But in this collection basis, we call him as principal. And here can you see this is the collecting bank. Seller's bank is known as a remitting bank. So we have a collecting bank, a remitting bank, the seller known as the principal and the buyer known as the drawee. The buyer known as the drawee. So documentary collection, how does this happen? On a site basis. The contract is agreed between the buyer and the seller, indicating documentary collection payable at site. So what is the method of settlement? Documentary collection payable at site. Seller arranges shipment of the goods according to the agreed terms. Forwards the underlying shipping documents through his bank. Now what is the seller's bank known as? The remitting bank. Now this remitting bank sends the document to the bank of the buyer. What is the bank of the buyer known as? The collecting bank. So we have the remitting bank, we have the collecting bank here. Sometimes as I told you, there will be in between a banker known as the remitting bank, collecting, presenting bank. Yes. So now let's see how does it happen. The collecting bank makes the documents available to review at the counter so that the buyer may make a decision regarding payment. The buyer authorizes payment. The collecting bank remits the proceeds to the remitting bank, releases the documents to the buyer. Then the buyer goes to the customs and clears the goods. So the remitting bank credits the amount to the account of the seller. So which bank credits the amount? The remitting bank to the account of the seller under advice. So, documentary collection on a site basis is a very simple procedure. Whereas if it is on nuisance basis, there is a reduced risk for both the buyer and the seller. But the buyer need not accept the draft presented with the collection until he has viewed all the documents at the collecting bank. Yes, his banker is a collecting bank. So the buyer need not accept the draft presented unless he has viewed all the documents which are sent to the collecting bank. So seller knows that his documents will be held there with the banking system. So there is some reduced risk to the seller that the shipping documents will be held with the banking system, and until such time as the draft is accepted. However, the seller has no undertaking that the draft will be honored on the due date, even if it is accepted. See, even if the draft is accepted by the buyer, that is the drawee, the seller has no undertaking that the draft will be honored on the due date. There is no commitment by the banker here. So, can you see? This is on usance basis. Buyer is also known as the drawee. Seller is also known as the principal. Buyer's bank, collecting bank. Seller's bank is the remitting bank. So, the remitting bank will credit amount to the account of the seller. Yes. So, this is the diagrammatic view of the documentary collection payable on usance basis. Now, let's see how this contract happens on usance basis. The contract is agreed between the buyer and seller. What is the method of payment? Documentary collection payable on usance basis. This is the method of settlement. Seller will arrange shipment of the goods according to the agreed terms. He will forward the underlying shipping documents to his bank. What is seller's bank known as? Remitting bank. Including a draft drawn on the buyer. That is why it is called usance. Why is it known as usance? There is a tenor. Tenor is a time. So there is a draft drawn on the buyer on the agreed payment terms. So this is the difference between sight and usance. Documentary collection on sight, documentary collection on usance. So the remitting bank will send the documents to the bank of the buyer, known as the collecting bank. The collecting bank makes the document available to the buyer to review at its counter. So the buyer can review the document. So the buyer will make a decision regarding acceptance of the draft. Draft is also known as bill of exchange. So acceptance of the bill of exchange, the buyer will make a decision. Once the buyer makes a decision, he accepts the draft. The collecting bank will inform the remitting bank that the buyer has accepted the draft. He will inform the collecting bank will inform the remitting bank that the buyer has accepted the draft and he has released the documents to the buyer. Because that is the reason for usance basis. Documents the buyer gets it after he gives the acceptance to the collecting bank. Now the collecting bank, they will retain the accepted draft. They will retain the accepted draft. And an advice of acceptance is sent to the remitting bank. Advice of acceptance is sent to the remitting bank. Or the draft can be returned back to the seller via the remitting bank prior to the maturity date. The seller will receive the accepted draft for presentation, representation on the maturity date or near to the maturity date. If the draft is written back, he will again present it nearer to the maturity date. So the payment of the accepted draft will happen as a result of the buyer making payment on the due date. So where is the buyer going to make the payment? On the due date. So or according to the new collection instructions being issued by the remitting bank. And to forward the accepted draft that had been previously written to the seller. So if the draft has been previously written to the seller, again it can be accepted. So in summary, under a documentary collection,